The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Managing Cybersecurity Risk, What We Learned in 2018 and What You Should Be Doing Today to Remain Protected. We'll be getting started shortly, but first I want to take a minute to go over the format of today's webinar. All phones have been placed on mute for this webinar. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the Questions tab in the menu, and we'll address questions if time permits. We will also be recording this session, and the recording will be sent out after the webinar. Again, thank you for joining us. At this point, I'd like to introduce today's two presenters. As a partner at Bloom, Jeff Ziplow is responsible for the firm's risk management and cybersecurity practice areas. He has significant experience working with organizations to assess their internal cybersecurity posture. Over the past several years, Jeff has been actively involved in providing cybersecurity and risk assessment presentations to many industries to enhance thought leadership in these areas. Jeff also works with the Connecticut's Office of the Attorney General to provide guidance and support on cybersecurity matters. Our second presenter, as a director at Bloom, David Nowacki has over 16 years of combined experience with information security and cybersecurity. I'll now hand it off to David to start today's presentation.
Thanks, Jared. The format of the presentation, we're going to provide you some information that we've obtained over the last year plus, and most of this is a combination of industry trends, data sources, research, and also what we see in the real world in client situations. And we aren't going to name any clients, but we will describe them just so you can understand what is happening out in the real world. Yep. Here's our contact information. We'll cycle that back through at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, shoot us an email or give us a call. So the agenda for today, we're going to run down some of the trends. Breaches are happening all over, big and small, and so we'll talk about that. Ransomware trends, that's been a very scary thing the last 5 or 6 years, and we're going to talk about what that looks like today, what the landscape will look like in 2019. Users continue to be your weakest link, and so that's one of the things we're going to hit on pretty hard throughout. Regulations, there are better and more expansive regulations out there. We'll give you an overview of those. There's some overviews or some overhauls in authentication and password practices that we want you to be aware of, and we'll talk about context. And then how to right-size security at your organization. We'll give you some suggestions. Data breaches. You can't go a day without seeing those in the news. And so we'll give you kind of an overview of what we're seeing. Some of the largest breaches on record happened in 2018. And one of the interesting things is not just the size of the breaches, but the types of data that are being breached and the value that has. So the Marriott one, I think, was the second or third largest on record that had names, addresses, credit card numbers, passport information, arrival, departure dates, very invasive. The Facebook breach, 30 million records that got into the type of data that you want held secret. So your personal information, who you interact with, all your check-in locations, where you are, in addition to some of the traditional things like medical records, SSNs, and credit cards. And so no data is really safe.
So David, I think the one thing this slide doesn't show, we're seeing the largest breaches, but these breaches are happening not only with large companies, but with small and medium companies throughout the United States and throughout the world, actually. And although these are the folks that are making the headlines, we're seeing more and more of the small, even mom and pop shops, if you will, and medium-sized businesses being attacked, particularly for ransomware, because the ransomware you need to pay, and there's a lot more mom and pop shops out there and middle market organizations that the attackers are going after.
Yeah, but I think we'll talk about that a little bit later on too. But the data that is being breached gives the cyber criminals ammo to target smaller organizations, and so you may be involved in a broader breach, a big breach, but that gives them ammunition to go directly at you with as a small, mid-sized business or as a smaller nonprofit, maybe a government agency as well. So what should you know about breaches? First bullet on the left, personal identifiable information and credit card numbers have value. That's usually an identity theft or a monetary value. But all of that data, where you go, who you are, how you refer to yourself in terms of username, password, those all have massive value to more advanced targeted schemes. And so you kind of need to have an expansive view on what data you have and where your employees, more importantly, may be have been breached, whether at work or otherwise. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. Over on the left or on the right, what you should do, you need to be thinking about breaches. They will happen. And so you need to be prepared to respond and evaluate and assess. Invest in trusted advisors, whether it's an attorney, whether you reach out to a cyber insurance company. If you don't have cyber insurance, you need to be looking into that today. And you also need to arm yourself with a number of computer forensic / cybersecurity companies. This doesn't mean that you have to have them under contract, but you need to know contacts. You need to be looking out for them today if and when the breach happens. And then ultimately, you need to make sure you educate your users to be aware of breaches, to be aware of hacking or anomalous activity like email account compromise, or to be aware of data breaches in general and where their accounts may have been impacted.
And I think, David, we're going to talk a lot more about the users, because the users are certainly a key attack vector that we're seeing more and more. And when you look at some of those big breaches that have occurred over time, there's a common theme. That theme is it started with a user's account of some sort being breached.
Yep. And a good example is if LinkedIn had a massive hack 2 or 3 years ago, and my business email, if I had used that, and the password that I had associated with that could have been involved in that breach. So they have my email account. If I don't do a nice job of changing the type of password that I have, all of a sudden our business is at risk. And so we'll certainly talk a lot more about users on the coming slides. First, let's hit ransomware, because Jeff talked about how important that was. Ransomware trends generally, and this is research-based, the number of attacks fell by 30% in 2018. That doesn't mean it's not a concern at all. What that means is the scattershot approach to sending hundreds of millions of emails to anonymous email accounts was on the decline. What has happened is we see an increase in targeted attacks and the volumes of targeted attacks for certain organizations in industries like healthcare, government, and financial services.
And David, in some ways, I challenge that percentage. And I say that because we actually know of many type of ransomware attacks that frankly didn't get in the news. Actually, one just happened yesterday, and I'll give you some bits and pieces of information about it, that it will never be in the news because of a couple reasons. One, the organization doesn't want it to become public because it could impact them. But I think what we're seeing is that people get these ransomware attacks, and the quickest and easiest way to resolve them is to pay the ransom. And we certainly get a lot of questions frequently about, well, if I pay the ransom, will I get that encryption key to decrypt all the information? And the answer is 99% of the time you do. Yeah. Because if they don't give you the encryption key, then their business model isn't going to work very well over a long period of time. So believe it or not, they actually have a business model out there that they follow as it relates to ransomware.
Yeah, and that's a great point. If you look at the second to lowest bottom bullet on the bottom there, that acronym stands for Ransomware as a Service. And it's a way for people to invest in ransomware schemes. I don't have to spin up my own ransomware scheme. I can buy into it and receive the benefits of people paying the ransom. And so that is something that is definitely trending upward. It's not as aggressive as the overall trends in ransomware, but it certainly is pretty expensive. Right. A couple basic stats on ransomware. Jeff mentioned how often you pay the ransom. About 75% or 70% of the businesses end up paying the ransom back. There are a significant amount of people who aren't having to pay the ransom because they have reliable backups, but still the best way to make sure that ransomware is off your network is to, one, you need to negotiate and figure out what your compromise is, but you also need to figure out, is it more beneficial to pay the ransom than bring in the cyber company to come and help you clean your network, or to just restore from backup. The average cost of a ransomware attack is off the charts. And this is average, so it doesn't include small ones as well. But you look at the ransom demands versus the cost of recovery and some of the hidden costs, and they're pretty significant. So that explains much of the data that we're seeing on that.
And so, if you, David, just for those of you who are listening, the city of Atlanta, the very first one up there, they paid $51,000, but that additional monies that you see, and I believe that 17 million is underestimated. But the reality is, it's lawyers' fees, it's technologies, people fees, it's investigation. Was any information taken out of the organization, or in this case, the city's systems? It also brought them down to their knees. No one could pay taxes. No one could pay utility bills. No one could access any information. And so not only, did we have to pay, a ransom, but it also brought their business down. They couldn't do things. They had to do everything manually. And as we all know, trying to do things manually these days can be very difficult. And we're seeing more and more of that.
Yeah, and I think that Jeff mentioned the cost was up to $50 million. I think the costs that aren't included on this slide are all of the infrastructure upgrades and the remediation. Correct. To make sure it never happens again. Yeah.
The interesting thing about the city of Atlanta, just one last point, is they had done an internal assessment, security assessment, and they had identified a boatload of things that they needed to do to increase their cybersecurity posture, and they had done it a year before. And unfortunately, they really didn't act to institute any of those new practices, protocols, and upgrade a lot of their systems.
Yeah. And that's a trend we see at many organizations. They get the security information, but they don't act on it. They don't budget for it appropriately. And we'll hit on that a little bit later as well. So how do you minimize the impacts of malware? Make sure you are using up-to-date antivirus, anti-malware software. That's at a minimum. And what's interesting, we didn't have data on one of the previous slides about this, but the majority of ransomware attacks still hit organizations that do have updated antivirus. And so there's other things that cause that. There are zero-day attacks and a few other things. But anyway, over on the right-hand side, what should you be doing? Make sure you're prepared. Make sure you have an incident response strategy, and make sure you're actually testing that, because time is of the essence when ransomware actually hits. Make sure you have a reliable continuous backup strategy that doesn't involve manual processes if you can afford it. Make sure you're testing that quarterly, ideally, but annually is the least frequency you should probably accept. And then, invest in next generation endpoint protection. If you haven't revisited your antivirus, anti-malware programs in a while, there are some excellent products that are out there in the marketplace the last 1 to 2 years, and there are wholly integrated platforms that you can actually invest in as well.
So, Dave, what do you mean by endpoint protection?
Endpoint protection is a combination of your the antivirus, anti-malware capabilities, along with some alerting and firewall integration. And so that's a generic description of what it is, but there are all-in-one platforms that interact with your firewalls, for example, that can not only prevent the malware from occurring any further than the moment it's first detected, but also take action to turn off activity at the firewall level to block traffic. And then there's some different the classic antivirus, anti-malware does signature-based, meaning it looks at a file that's named a certain thing. There are other things that can look at the behavior. Is this normal user behavior? Is it not? And right. Detect the presence of malware in the absence of a signature.
And so by endpoint, you're really talking about the individual PCs and computers, I would imagine,
Yeah.
mobile devices as well,
Yes.
and any type of wireless devices that are connecting up to your network.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, endpoints are just that. That's the user devices, that's firewalls, that's servers, and everything else.
Okay.
Yep. So back to users. Users are your weakest link. Every cyber criminal out there knows that. Here's a diagram that basically shows your firewalls, your infrastructure, all the security that is around it. And the easiest way for me to compromise your organization is to jump right over that, send them an email, give them a call, send them a text, and you're in. So some of the most popular attacks in 2018 that we saw. Spear phishing. If you haven't heard of spear phishing, that is a targeted attack using phishing, which is a malicious email where the cyber criminal pretends to be a legitimate person, either an internal employee that you may have or a customer or someone like that. Whaling is a form of spear phishing that is going to those most targeted people in your organization. So think CEO, CFO, CIO, your executive team, the same individuals that probably have the most power and authority in your organization, and also those people who often have a lot of the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. Business email compromise is a combination of attacks. And we threw some sub-bullets on there. Payroll redirect. So through a combination of social engineering, developing a relationship with you over time, they convince your payroll personnel to redirect direct deposit accounts and files. Same thing with the ACH and wire transfer scheme, where your CEO asks for a wire to be processed, in an afternoon where activity may be low and $30,000, $50,000 goes out the door. Mailbox compromise is something where you convince an employee to give you their username and password as one scenario, and they compromise the mailbox. And this is prevalent in cloud email accounts like Office 365 or G Suite, Gmail accounts, where me as a cyber criminal will log into your account. You won't know about it, but I'll set up mailbox forwarding rules. And so I have visibility into all of your email traffic, and I can start to log in as you and convince people to send payments in the wrong direction, or wait for that opportunity that there's a deal being closed, or forward email that is a legitimate outside your organization. The W-2 scam is something you see a lot during tax season, where they convince payroll or HR personnel to send W-2 files out the door. Jeff, do you have any interesting stories to share about?
Sure. Well, I always have a bunch of stories. I think a couple points. One, David is dead on as far as we're seeing a lot of business email compromise, and this is really becoming rampant, quite frankly. One of the questions I always ask clients is, if I took a thumb drive and I planted it outside in your parking lot, or somehow I were able to get into an office space and take a thumb drive, what would a user do? How would they react to it? Would they take that thumb drive and put it on their computer and see if they could find out who that thumb drive was associated with? Would they take that thumb drive and throw it in the garbage? Or would they take that thumb drive and give it to IT for their inspection? But by the way, the right answer in all of that is give it to IT and have them review and assess, because they typically know what to do and the protocols to follow. Certainly if the person attempts to put that thumb drive on their PC, then all sorts of bad things can happen. I can have a keylogger program downloaded automatically, which will track all keystrokes that a person does, and then it does a phone home, if you will, behind the scenes. So no one really knows that it's happening, but all my user IDs and passwords for various accounts can be compromised. Some of you might think that throwing it in the garbage is a great idea. The reality is, you never know what dumpster divers are around, and if someone saw a USB drive in a garbage can, they might pull it out and put it into their computer. So, the right answer is give it to IT. But going back to your comment, we've seen a lot of issues related to the email compromise and people asking for W-2 information, people asking to change the bank and routing transfer information. And there's a technology out there, and it's been out there for a while, I'm going to share it with you in a second, that will help to alleviate this problem. And it's called the telephone. I always recommend that if someone's asking for W-2 information, if someone's asking for ACH information or changing ACH information, you should pick up the phone with a telephone number, an established phone number, not a phone number that's in the email, by the way, but a phone number that is part of your standard records, and make the phone call. And even if you're calling the CEO or some type of senior management executive, it's worth the phone call. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be on the other side, because that's the losing side if you gave out valuable information and or wire transferred information or wire transferred money to an account that is in China that you will not be able to get back.
Yeah. An interesting story on the mailbox compromise. A client contacted us sometime toward the end of the year, and they actually had one of their customers complain about a compromised payment, an ACH payment that they were due. And what had happened was the company that called us had their email box hacked. And same scenario I described a couple minutes ago, where it was a mailbox forwarding rule. The perpetrator spoofed or logged in legitimately as what became our client and convinced the customer to send the payment to the wrong direction. So the dollars that were out were, a routine payment, monthly payment for the largest account that they had. And who's at fault in that situation? Was it the company who sent the payment out the door, or was it the company whose mailbox was compromised that led to the social engineering attack? So there's some interesting scenarios that are out there.
And I would say one last point here, David, is that, and it happened actually yesterday, and wish it didn't happen, but there was a ransomware situation, and I was talking to one of the management folks, and they had identified a month before that their email account got hacked, and that emails were being sent from their email account, but they weren't the ones that were sending the email. So that's why I believe his in this case email account was hacked. And when I asked this person who he spoke to about it, he said, well, I didn't speak to anyone. I just, renamed my password, and, I went on. And the reality is that we need to educate users and train users that it's okay to come and tell us that something's going on with my email account, or something happened today that we need IT to be aware of, because it's not like a fine wine that's going to age well over time. If an email account got hacked, we need to know about it not 2 days from now, not a month from now. We need to know about it immediately when it happens. And we need to give guidance to employees as it relates to that more and more.
Yeah, so what you should know, what you should do. Employees, they're always going to click on the wrong emails, send information out the door they're not supposed to, connect personal infected devices, browse suspect sites, personal email, and other cloud storage. The reason for that is, even though we try to educate them, we also overload them. We ask them to do more and more each day, and to be responsive at the drop of a dime to our responses and our customers' responses. So educate your employees. You need to start phishing your employees. If you haven't looked into this, there's some awesome technologies out there that allow you to proactively phish your employees, set up the very same emails that are hitting their inbox today, and see who's prone to click. And as Jeff mentioned, require quick escalation of any suspect activity. There's no embarrassment to admitting that you may have had your email address account.
So, David, out of those items that you just discussed, what's the top one? If you had to pick one, what would you pick and say you have to do this as soon as possible?
I think you should phish your employees today. I think you should be doing that today. And there's some affordable options that are out there where you can assess their resiliency today. So that's number one. Number two, you didn't ask for number two, but number two is those bottom bullet, the very attacked persons in your organization, those executives that don't want to go to the training, you need to talk to them today. You need to talk to them today about what they're clicking on, how they respond to certain things, because they're the ones who are going to open the door to a lot of exposure in an organization. 2018 saw some interesting trends in cybersecurity and privacy regulations. So we have state privacy laws. Each state that we work with has their own unique privacy laws. Each have different requirements.
Do you know which is the best state that has the best privacy laws?
I don't know if there is a best state, but many of them require very strict turnaround times once you realize there's a breach.
And I would suggest that Massachusetts actually has some of the better privacy and data security laws out there. They have something called CMR 17.00, which is their privacy standard. And out of all 50 states or so, that when you look at who and what the different data security programs are, Massachusetts has one, and they require people within Massachusetts who are holding on to Massachusetts resident information. They really but tell you how you need to secure the information. And if anyone's interested, that's something pretty good to take a look at, and they can provide some good guidance out there. Certainly all of it is web-based.
Yeah. Some of the items that hit the headlines, GDPR, which is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. The scope of that is not just European companies. It also includes organizations who do business overseas, and some that obtain personal information from European citizens. So that is an expansive regulation that is going to start to be modeled after here in the U.S. State of California implemented something that was very similar, that expanded scope and actually pushed a lot of the rights out to users to know where their data is, how it's being used, who it's being sold to. And I think one of the things that we continue to see in our work is just general awareness on like PCI compliance and other regulations. Many people who accept payment cards think that just because they use a PCI compliant terminal, that they are compliant, and there's still a pretty significant compliance burden on you when it comes to PCI.
So, Dave, I get asked this question all the time. We don't store credit card information, right? We use a third-party processor.
Yeah.
So do I need to worry about PCI at all? Is that something that, it's their problem, not my problem?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. Absolutely, you still need to worry about PCI. You are not compliant just because you use an external provider. There are somewhere in the realm of 20 to 40 requirements that would apply to you regardless, but not the full 250 to 300 requirements that you would if you were accepting payments electronically and storing them electronically as well.
Okay.
So what do you know? What should you do? I would say just become more aware of what regulations are out there. Don't accept that you aren't compliant, that you aren't required to comply with them. And then if you have any concerns, make sure you hire someone to do a gap assessment. I would say starting with something like PCI or a privacy regulation. And if you're in manufacturing and you haven't heard of the defense acquisition regulation related to NIST 800-171, which is a National Institute of Standards and Technology document for cybersecurity protection. If you are in aerospace or Department of Defense supply chain in any capacity, at any level, you are obligated to comply with that. moving to best practices, I mentioned before there was an overhaul or a kind of a paradigm shift in how you're managing authenticators. And what that means is traditional authentication is username and password. It has been for the last 30 years, and it's going to continue to be important. Some of the trends, if you hear about them, it sounds as though they're being easier on authentication, easier on password length. Bullet number one there, multi-factor is now a must. You can't just have a username and password. You have to have an additional factor. So in some cases, that's going to be something you are, a biometric, like a thumbprint or an eye reader. That's way down the line, but a device that you have that calls back or generates a one-time password. There's authenticator apps that you have to enter a PIN that's generated each time you try to log in. And so that's a device that you have. There's the traditional RSA tokens that generate random numbers you implement as well. So multi-factor is now a must. Passwords with that and the right practices can be shorter and easier to remember. That doesn't mean that you can go back to 6-character passwords. In fact, it's going to always be a minimum of 8 in terms of the best practice guidance. But you should allow your users to generate up to 64 characters. And so this document that I cite, that NIST SP 800-63, is not a pass to lower your password length. It's a strategy to manage authenticators and to get more reliable in how you are authorizing access to your system.
So David, if you were to give guidance as to what you should do from a password perspective, what would it be? The top 3 things that come to mind.
Yeah, I would say require users to be smart and intelligent in their selection of passwords. And if they can't manage passwords, get a password saver or a random number generator to manage passwords. That's probably the biggest thing, is to educate them. NIST has said in their research that the biggest exposure now is insecure password practices by users imposed upon by the traditional settings that we have. So password length becoming increasingly longer, more frequent changes of usernames and passwords. And so if you allow people to generate a passphrase that has complexity requirements, that is a length in which they'll remember, and then raise awareness on when accounts could be compromised and some of the things we mentioned before by escalating potential breaches, you can restrict or lower the longer length.
So I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to disagree a bit, right? So, if I were to give guidance, I'd say you should have a minimum of a 10-character complex password, and that password should be based on a group, a term, right? So I typically use the term, I love the New England Patriots on Sunday. And based on that term, or that phrase, if you will, I use a combination of upper and lowercase characters, but it gives me the opportunity to bend a little bit and change it over time.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's an excellent guidebook. If people are having trouble not remembering, 10 is a good standard. I think 14 is better. And if you use multi-factor with a lot of other things that this document outlines, there are ways to be easier on that password length.
But do I need to change it, every 30 days, every 60 days, every 90 days, every 180 days? What are your thoughts?
What I would say is minimum 180. What NIST says, and this is going to be controversial, is you only need to expire passwords when you suspect they're breached. And that's one of those things that I think will continue to make its rounds in security discussions for the next several years.
Got it. One last question before we get off of the password. There's the challenge questions, right? Which tends to be part of multi-factor authentication,
Yeah.
right? So many of the financial institutions, will be asking for bank account, personal bank accounts and other types of challenge questions. Where were you born? Who's your favorite dog? Your mother's maiden name.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
There's an entire appendix in this NIST document that covers that, and it's definitely an additional layer of verification. It's not a multiple factor, but it's a way to register a device and verify.
So here's my point. I think that people need to be very careful about that multi-factor component, that challenge question, because to be quite frank, on social media, I know where you were born, I know what high school you went to, I know what your dog's favorite or what your favorite dog's name is. I know a lot of stuff. And so if you're answering those questions truthfully, then the reality is I can pretty much guess what those answers could be.
Yeah.
So you may want to consider using a totally different answer.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? So, who's your favorite, where were you born? Well, you could put, shortcake. Well, it has no meaning, right? But it has certainly something, it has meaning to you of how you're answering questions.
Yes, that's an excellent strategy. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. What you should know, what you should do. Basically, like I mentioned for NIST, their users' behavior is the biggest risk, and so you need to make sure you're pursuing a multi-factor authentication strategy. Certainly for anything that's cloud access and remote access, if you have a web-based mail program, you need to consider multi-factor like now, and encourage users to use separate email passwords for their day-to-day and non-work accounts. That is one of those exposures that it's the hidden exposure where if I have, again, my LinkedIn account is breached and I'm using the same password and my email address as I use for work, they now have access to my work account. And then the last thing I would say is hire someone to come in and do a password complexity test on your users. There are some great technologies out there that allow you to look at the relative strength of your users' passwords and see whether there's dictionary words that are present or there's password 123 and that type of thing. So how do you right-size security in your organization? We're going to run down a series of kind of must-do practices you should definitely be considering this year if you aren't already doing them. Right now is encryption. We know that employees are losing devices and laptops, leave them in the car, leave them at a train station. That is happening all the time. They send information right out the door, usernames, passwords, phishing emails, they respond to them. And so, encryption, having the smart encryption strategy will reduce your exposure. And in some cases, it'll minimize your compliance burden from a data breach implementation perspective. But I would say don't encrypt everything. Don't jump out and encrypt everything because it's going to be cost prohibitive in some cases. But definitely implement a smart encryption strategy that allows, at a minimum, the encryption of all mobile devices and laptops. And there are some technologies you're probably paying for today, especially if you're in a Windows-based environment. There are technologies you just turn on that enable you to encrypt all laptops. The third bullet in the bottom there, force TLS encryption for all outbound emails. That's transport layer security. It's a feature for email servers to only transport to other email servers via encryption. And so there are ways to force that or to give the default option to encrypt. When you can, encrypt server drives and table spaces where it's prudent. There's often performance implications here. You need to make sure that you're smart in implementing these, and usually as part of a server upgrade or a system upgrade, you can encrypt at that same time. And then by all means, prohibit the use of mass storage devices. This is your emails and external hard drives. If they aren't encrypted, you need to make sure you're not doing that because that's where all your data goes out the door.
And the one thing I would point out here, David, is that if there is a lost laptop and it is encrypted, if and when, it's more of a when, you go to the Attorney General's office and you need to report that you have missing laptop, you'll have a very different conversation if you say, well, we're not exactly sure what was on the laptop, but it was encrypted. Because that word encryption, and it should be a good encryption software, will help protect you. It'll help protect the data that's on the laptop or the phone from getting in the hands of the perpetrator. And so I think I can't stress it enough. Encrypt wherever you can, I think, is really the message we're trying to deliver.
Yeah. The next one is related to improving your security capabilities. So one of the interesting trends we're going to see this year, but also in the next 3, 4, 5 years, is the demand for security professionals is going to go up significantly, and there just aren't going to be enough jobs. So we're going to be fighting for the same group of employees or prospects with anyone else.
I think you meant to say there aren't going to be enough people for jobs.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
There are going to be plenty of jobs.
Yes. There are going to be plenty of vacancies out there, not enough people to fill those jobs.
Right.
You're going to have to figure out how to instill those skills in your organization. And the unfortunate thing is security is highly specialized. Traditional employees are focused on operating the technology that they have, keeping it up and operating, and assuring accessibility. To ask them to learn security at the same time is a very daunting task and almost impossible for most of them. Security professionals focus on breaking systems. They think like hackers and attackers, and they're trained to evaluate all the holes and exploit those holes. And so most organizations don't have the budgets to fill both positions. And as I mentioned before, there's going to be a gap. There's not going to be enough talent to fill. So you need to make sure you're selecting a trusted advisor. You need to figure out what cybersecurity company you may be able to get some guidance from, whether that's a quarterly touch point, a trusted advisor to come in and help set strategy, a risk assessment that you can have them perform. In any event, you need to make sure you're hiring someone, and you may have a staff augmentation strategy where you hire a cybersecurity company to come in a couple days a month to help you get better at security. That's probably the best option if you can't hire someone internally.
So David, is that, I've heard the term CISO.
Yeah.
CISO stands for what, and what does that do?
Yeah, that would be your Chief Information Security Officer. So that's an individual who looks at a high level what you're doing to manage cyber risk. They have that risk assessment mindset. They have an eye toward the types of threats and exposures you may be facing within your organization, given the size, complexity of your infrastructure, and they set the high-level strategy. Along with that, you may have security engineers. You may have people who are more in the weeds on managing your infrastructure from a security perspective, tightening them, locking them down, hardening them according to best practices, and that type of thing. And the last two bullets are probably a bit more, I would say, controversial, especially if I put my security auditor hat on, and that's you need to focus more on your controls and implementing critical security controls and less on the formality of documenting policies and procedures. Certainly, I want to see a robust information security plan, and it's a prerequisite for most regulations and some contracts. But if you had a choice between looking at how secure your infrastructure was and hiring someone to come in and or writing a policy and procedure manual, I'd focus on those critical security practices first and looking at your infrastructure.
I think the other thing that just to add here is it's good to get an outside independent perspective. And I'm not trying to do self-promotion right now. I think that, and we've seen it a couple of times where an IT director feels they have everything in control, and many times they do, but there are also times where they just don't know what they don't know. Case in point, we ran into a situation recently where it was at an independent school, as it turns out, and they put in this whole new security system with cameras and locking mechanisms and everything else. And when we did the IT assessment, one of the things we found is that the vendor who implemented that never changed the standard user ID and password. And so what we were able to do is we went out on the internet, we found what a standard user ID and password for their system was, and we were able to externally go in and access the system with administrative password credentials. And we could open doors, we could lock doors, we could move cameras around. turn off various aspects of their security. And so their IT person, was welcoming, which was excellent. And they actually said, wow, we never knew this. We assumed that our third-party vendor that we brought in to provide this would provide clarity and higher level of security, and that just didn't happen. So I think sometimes it's not a bad idea to just have someone independent come in and do that self-assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great practice. We'll hit on vulnerability assessments in a couple pages, but that is one of those ways to get someone to have that high-level look at what you're doing from a security perspective. Glad you mentioned vendors, because that's the next slide. Is the risk associated with third-party vendors is tremendous. Often we blindly trust the capability of third-party vendors, and we don't necessarily contractually obligate them to do security. Some of the largest data breaches that we have on record were associated with third parties who organizations trusted to secure infrastructure. And so if you have managed service providers, maybe you don't have IT staff in-house. Not all managed service providers for IT are created equal, and not all contracts and agreements are created equal, meaning they may not do security well. They may not have the talent to do security well, and they may scope out security from your statements of work and your support plan. And so you need to start looking at those things and asking them what they do from a security perspective, how they can provide some assurance.
So are you saying cloud vendors are good or bad? Using a cloud vendor is good or bad?
I think a cloud vendor is a good practice as long as you understand when you're vetting them prior to entering into a contract what their security is. And this is where it comes in. You ask for things like a SOC 2 report, which is an independent audit of that vendor's security controls.
Okay.
You look for periodic penetration tests or vulnerability assessments. You engage with them on what their security obligation is. If they have a breach or they notify a breach, what is their obligation to notify you? Do you have that in a contract or do you not? Do they actually have cyber insurance that covers their professional relationship with customers, or is it just their own? You need to engage in those discussions during your vendor due diligence process.
So I would have assumed that if I'm working with a cloud vendor and they're storing my information, it's their responsibility to protect it. And if their systems get breached, am I on the hook?
The answer is probably yes. You're compliant. Your data, your obligation to protect, and this is where laws are great in some jurisdictions, and they're just not specified in others. Who is the custodian of the data versus who's the owner of the data is not always covered.
And so what do you recommend?
What I recommend is making sure you have it very clear in your contracts and that you understand what their security practices are like. And that's where it says you need to require a SOC 2 if you have the ability to, or you need to ask for those external certifications on security. Or if you have the option, hire an independent vendor to do a security assessment and make sure you include right to audit or right to assessment clauses in your contract.
Got it. Okay.
Vendor access. We need to understand who has access from a vendor perspective, how often they access your systems. Here's some basic overview of the types of data security protections you should have if vendors are going to have access to your system. Make sure you limit privileges. Don't give them your domain administrative access. You make sure you log logins, log-offs, unsuccessful login attempts, and that type of thing. And make sure you have the proper protocols for terminating external users as well, meaning removing their access when they no longer need it.
So what kind of vendors should have access to a network?
If you have a managed service provider and no other IT resources, you may allow them access. It shouldn't be unrestricted. You should, if you can, implement a procedure where you authorize that remote access each and every time. Some software providers who are doing the upgrades for you and need to reboot servers and install packages, yes, for certain amounts of time they should have access to that, but you shouldn't have unrestricted 24/7, 365 access to a vendor.
Okay.
Yep.
The other thing maybe to think about also is that there's some vendors that you might not think about For example, HVAC vendors, right?
Yeah.
A lot of HVAC systems are on a network. So they're a vendor that might have access to the network.
Yeah.
Voice systems are now on the network. So those are vendors that I think you need to monitor and control, or at least have some good protocols in place to secure the systems they have access to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think any good vendor management practice has, who's your vendor, what purpose do they serve, what access do they have, is it actually required, and you need to engage in those conversations. Reducing incident response times. So I've seen so many different figures on the what you should know section there. The average attack or virus is on your network for 200 plus days before it's detected. We also know that alert logs, if you deploy a server or a system out of the box, usually they're overwritten within a month just because of the type of data that's being tracked. It's volumes and volumes of alerts. And then no one, traditionally people don't look at your IT employees or your IT admin accounts. And so what we suggest is that you look into a technology called a SIEM, and it's a security incident event management system. There are some affordable options out there. There's also some very robust, highly capable options as well. What this does is it looks at alerts and ingests log data in real time. It retains it and protects it from cyber criminals or insiders that may be deleting logs after they go and do something they aren't supposed to be doing. And then this technology correlates those behaviors in real time across your organization and allows you to set up alerting rules so that you look at a real world threat scenario where an IT admin account, which is authorized access, is doing things anomalously. They're logging in during off hours when you don't think they should be doing it, and a variety of other scenarios. And so you can start to weed through all of that alerting activity to threats and actually comparing that to threats that these technologies are seeing in the real world. It's a very, very, very highly capable technology, and it's one of those things where if you're not looking at it right now, you should probably start investigating it in some type of an alerting system.
So does it stop a threat per se?
Some of the more advanced ones can do that, but again, if you aren't receiving a notification at all,
right,
and in a situation like the mailbox forwarding rule scam that I told you about before, you would get an alert this afternoon. When it's compromised this afternoon, it wouldn't be 2-3 weeks later. You can generate an alert on that type of thing and get the alert right away. In some cases, the platforms actually go into the intrusion prevention realm, which is where they actively take steps to block traffic. And as Jeff mentioned before, you need to get an independent assessment. If you haven't had a cybersecurity firm come in and look at the vulnerabilities in your network, look at the practices, it's a really good practice to have. We recommend annually at a minimum. Ideally, it's going to be more frequently than that, and it really depends on the type of technologies you have, the frequency of change in your organization, and that type of thing. Some of the things that we see commonly, those managed service providers or IT vendors who aren't doing what they should be doing. They may plug in a server, spin it up, install Windows and a couple other features, and leave it wide open. Missing patches, inconsistent configurations, networks that are deployed to ensure accessibility, a flat network, meaning the moment I'm in any one of the doors, I have access to everything. So not building in layers of security. And there's a few other things that I bulleted out there as well, but it's a good practice to get an independent assessment and actually do something with that. Because as Jeff mentioned at the very beginning, there was a company that did an assessment a year ago, knew all the holes, and then weren't able to take any action to close it.
And ultimately were breached.
Yes, ultimately were breached, yes, and that's the key. And so with that, we're gonna kind of move on to questions and answers. One of the questions that was submitted, what's your opinion on password manager apps? That's an excellent question. And I would say it really does depend on the type of app that you use. Generally speaking, to have a password manager app where all of your passwords are in the exact same in one place, it's a little bit daunting. It's concerning to have all your keys in one place. But generally, there's a biometric authenticator, which means like the facial recognition authenticator or a thumbprint authenticator associated with that, or you can require a lengthy password in order to access the vault, so to speak. That technology is extremely valuable, and it's a great technology, but I would say it depends on the type of password manager you have.
Right, and it was funny. I was at a presentation giving a similar cyber discussion, if you will, and the same question came up, and I said, well, passwords managers can be okay, and I got challenged, if you will, on the word okay, and it's most password managers are solid technologies. The problem with password managers is that if you don't put in the appropriate level of security up front, i.e. A fairly long password complex, then if it does get broken into, now they've got the keys to all your kingdom or kingdoms, and that becomes an issue. So I think that, from my perspective, they are good, and actually they can be great. We just need to make sure that when you're going to use one of these, you need to make sure that you're using the highest form of security available. I like your idea about the thumbprint, right, or facial recognition. That's certainly becoming, very popular. But if not either one of those two, an extremely long, complex password is something that I would highly recommend.
And I would say, like the password manager that I use for my personal life with all of my apps, that requires a complex password and my face, and then I don't even know the passwords for 20 or so of my apps. They're all randomly generated 30-character passwords.
So would you mix and match? Would you have two different password managers, one for business, daily work, and then one for your personal life?
Yeah, I would make sure for business, certainly you make sure you are you have an approved list of password managers, and you educate your employees about what is the best practice for that.
Sounds good. One of the questions we had is, how long is a SOC 2, how frequently do you need to perform a SOC 2 audit? How frequently should it be updated? The reality is a SOC 2 audit should be done on an annual basis. Most of them are. There are two flavors, if you will, of a SOC 2 audit, a type 1 and a type 2. A type 1 is a review, an audit on the design of controls, and it's as of point in time. A type 2 SOC 2 audit is not only a review of the design of controls, but we're actually testing that the controls are operating effectively. And that's for a range of time, typically no less than 6 months, and more probable for an entire year. And that gets done on an annual basis. And you should be asking for, if you are using some type of outside service organization, you should be asking for, and to be quite frank, demanding their SOC 2 audit. If they don't have one, it doesn't mean you throw the vendor out. I think there are a lot of vendors who are starting to realize they need to have an audit performed that's independent. It also helps to protect them to some extent. Other thoughts on SOC 2, Dave?
Yeah, I think that you may get some pushback in that the SOC report doesn't expire ever, and while that's certainly true, it's a point in time or for a period of time. It doesn't assess today's security practices. So I would say annually you need to be asking or requiring a SOC 2.
So should we be asking for some type of security audit or standard for just vendors?
There's a lot of developments in this space, and there's a SOC 2 for cybersecurity, which actually hits on the vendor category, not on the system category. And there are some emerging things like shared assessments, which is a standard way to gather information and assess information. I would say at a minimum, make sure you have your own security questionnaires in the absence of a SOC 2 that you can ask.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, we just want to say thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, Jeff Ziplo, or David Nowacki. Our emails and phone numbers are on the screen at this point. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.